Excellencies, dear colleagues, welcome to this new Bit Plastic Pollution Dialogue, a series of events that we have launched before the adoption 2 years ago of a historical resolution at the United Nations Environmental Assembly, setting up the path to a global plastics treaty to end plastic pollution. This series of dialogues making links with ongoing multilateral processes to tackle plastic pollution is organized by the Geneva Environment Network in collaboration with the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, the Center for International Environmental Law, the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the Forum on Trade, Environment, and the SDGs, the University of Geneva, and the governments of Norway and of Switzerland. The Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop the international legally binding instrument that was set up following the adoption of the resolution is meeting for its 5th session at the end of this month in Busan, in the Republic of Korea. The Road to Busan event series, organized as part of the Geneva Bit Plastic Pollution Dialogues in collaboration with various partners, provides member states and stakeholders a platform to prepare for the upcoming negotiation by launching new reports and initiatives and hosting briefings and discussions for a timely outcome of this very important negotiation. Today's dialogue is organized by the University of Wollongong and with the support of the Minderoo Foundation. We are joined today by the authors of this new report, Analysis of Government's Authority to Mitigate Micro and Nanoplastic Releases through a closed-loop design to inform the global plastics treaty negotiations. This report that we are indeed launching at this event. Before you are formally welcome, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of the event will be made available as usual on the page of this event. The link has been shared in the chat and is also available on the slides of the event. Throughout the event, you can raise questions by using the Q&A box. We will use them to feed the discussion during the Q&A session. There's a slide showing you how to access this Q&A box. The transcript is also available in over 100 languages, as indicated in this new slide. To formally welcome you, we are joined today by representatives of 2 member states actively involved in the INC plastics pollution process. Ms. Karen Haubenheimer, the lead author of the report we are launching today, will chair this event immediately after the opening statements. So now let's formally start this event. It is our pleasure to turn first to Moe Paulo, the acting director of the Department of Environment of Tuvalu and member of the INC delegation, who has pre-recorded her message due to the time zone difference. So let's hear her now.
Aloha everyone, my name is Moijesina Saitala Paula from the Department of Environment. As someone deeply involved in the International Negotiating Committee on Plastic Pollution and working within Tuvalu's Department of Environment, I witnessed firsthand and immense challenges our nation faces when it comes to managing plastic waste. Being closely engaged with the Department of Waste Management, I see daily the impacts of plastic pollution, not only on our fragile environment, but also on the health and livelihood of our people. Tuvalu, despite its small size and low contribution to global pollution, is bearing the brunt of plastic crisis that is not our making. Our island nation, with its limited resources and geographical isolation, is struggling to manage the influx of plastic waste, especially microplastics and nanoplastics. These tiny particles, often invisible to the naked eye, are pervasive in our marine environment, threatening our fisheries, food security, and the overall well-being of our communities. Without proper facilities for monitoring or technical capacity to analyze the presence and impacts of microplastics, we find ourselves at a significant disadvantage. Our oceans are a lifeline. The contamination of these waters with microplastics is not just an environmental issue, it is a direct threat to our survival. At the international level, there is so much that can and must be done. As part of the global community addressing plastic pollution, I call for stronger, more inclusive international policies. It is not enough to simply capture or clean up these particles after they have been released. We must tackle this issue at its source by redesigning plastics to minimize their contribution to microplastics and nanoplastic pollution. We need to transition towards the materials and production method that prioritize a closed-loop system, one that prevents these harmful particles from entering our oceans in the first place. I also urge the international community to provide the necessary support to small island nations like Tuvalu. We need technical and financial support to build our capacity for effective waste management, data collection, and pollution mitigation. Without this, our efforts will be severely limited, and the effects of plastic pollution will continue to threaten our ecosystems and our way of life. Plastic pollution, particularly microplastics, is a global issue that requires global solutions. Through international cooperation, shared research, and innovative approaches, we can work towards reducing plastic releases and creating a more sustainable future, not just for Tuvalu, but for the world.
We thank for her message. And we are now delighted to give the floor to Ms. Tulia Toika, the IMC focal point for Finland, to close this opening session of the event. Ms. Toika, the floor is yours. I think something happened. She just left the event, so let's wait a few seconds for Ms. Tulia to get back. I guess that instead of clicking on a meeting, she might have clicked on leaving the event. I guess there she is. So, Ms. Toika, I was saying that you have now the floor.
Thank you very much, and sorry, I just dropped off when Paula was finishing. Okay, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. I guess we have joined this event from all around the globe. I'm glad to see so many of us joining today to discuss the important issue of micro and nanoplastic pollution. And we are getting really close to the final round of the negotiations on a global treaty to end plastic pollution. It is actually just less than 3 weeks from now that we will meet in Busan. And in Busan, we must uphold the ambition that was agreed in UNEP 5, and we must agree on an international legally binding treaty to end plastic pollution. Today's topic, micro and nanoplastics, are closely interlinked to the INC negotiations. The University of Wollongong report will soon be presented to you by the authors. But did you know that this year marks the 20th anniversary of the first scientific article that was using the term microplastics to describe the occurrence of tiny fragments of plastics in the environment? Since then, our knowledge about the sources, pathways, impacts of plastic pollution have increased exponentially. The scientists are concerned about the extent of damage that the microplastics can cause to both humans and the environment. Therefore, I believe that this report that will be launched today is very much needed. The recommendations of this report are actually very similar to a recent statement by the Ministers of Environment of the Nordic countries. The Nordic ministers called for dedicated measures to regulate microplastics in the future plastic treaty. Both the report and the Nordic ministers have said that the actions should include bans or restrictions on intentionally added microplastics, and also requirements for improved product design to minimize the release of microplastics during the product use. In addition to these measures, the report makes a reference to enhancing science policy interface, which actually also happens to be a long-term priority for the Nordic countries. The scientific research is very important in addressing emerging issues such as chemicals of concern. In the context of the future plastic treaty, scientific guidance could be needed to support listing of products with primary microplastics as avoidable products. And the treaty could also set thresholds for secondary releases. And this latter one could perhaps be done as a part of the product design provision. Furthermore, I think that there's a need to apply precautionary principle. This will help to effectively address microplastics, also in the situations where strong scientific evidence is still lacking. Actually, applying precautionary principle has been very helpful in developing the EU legislation. It might be the reason why the EU has restricted placing on the market of intentionally added microplastics. And EU is also seeking some ways, effective ways to restrict the secondary releases of microplastics. I also noted from the report that the precautionary principle has been adopted in some other environmental treaties like Stockholm Convention, so it should be possible in the Plastics Treaty as well. Finally, the report shows that microplastics function as vectors of chemicals of concern, carrying them deep into human tissues. And the report explains that this amplifies the effect of harmful chemicals. This makes it even more important to address both microplastics and the chemicals of concerns in the Plastic Treaty. In the INC, we will unfortunately have limited time to agree on necessary elements of the treaty, and we therefore need to consider which part of the technical work can be done in the period between the adoption of the treaty and the first conference of the parties. Surely, I hope that the discussion on the micro and nanoplastics is one of those topics that will be further worked after Busan. But now, I wish us all a fruitful conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tulia, and thank you also to Moe for those opening statements. Also like to thank Diana and her team for organising and helping us to host the launch of this report. I think if we can, we'd like to just move into the next phase, which is the discussion on the report. And I'll give us a brief introduction to the report. I'm just waiting for control of the PowerPoint. There we go, coming. So the report that we are launching here today is titled Analysis of Government's Authority to Mitigate Micro and Nanoplastic Releases Through Closed Loop Design to Inform the Global Plastics Treaty, as Diana mentioned. Oops. So I'll provide a brief introduction to the report. But with this report, we really wanted to re-emphasize some of the positions on micro and nanoplastics, which we feel are almost losing ground in the negotiations of the plastics instrument a bit. Here, we felt we must not lose focus that micro and nanoplastics, or MNP, as we have referred to them, and probably will through the rest of the presentation, that these pose their own unique form of hazard, which goes beyond that of macroplastic pollution. We also want to re-emphasize that we are now unable to escape MNP, and they are posing a risk to our health. So in this report, we discuss the body of evidence and how this evidence supports policy action now to mitigate our exposure to MNP, and also supported by how to use existing authority to regulate them. And we end with some proposed approaches to address MNP in the Global Plastics Instrument, including how they are reflected in the chair of the negotiating committee's latest non-paper. So what we've tried to illustrate in our report is that we show that the role of science in policymaking can depend on whether the precautionary principle is included in a country's legal frameworks. We have 3 case studies of the US, which does not have the precautionary principle to guide policymaking and must therefore rely on reactive actions such as litigation and a strong scientific burden of proof before policy can really be shifted, versus the EU that has a clear implementation of the precautionary principle. And this allows for a more flexible scientific burden of proof, and they can also adopt policy in a more proactive way. We also highlight the difficulties of a country like Tuvalu, as we heard, who has limited ability to change the design of products entering their market, and really needs the plastics agreement to help them with the design component of the life cycle. So another area that we tried to illustrate in our report is that we previously had a false idea about the safety of plastics.
which are now being shattered as we look at ourselves and the environment through a microscope. So it's the stuff we can't see that is the problem, and this problem is shared at each stage of the plastic's life cycle. It starts with plastics as a material, which is inherently friable, so it sheds MNP by design. We try to fix this by adding chemicals, but this hasn't worked 100%. So we see MNP being released even during intended use of a product, and this is accelerated if we apply heat, such as in a microwave, and other factors. This has implications for our reuse, refill, and repair solutions which we're promoting, because as these products get older, they shed more MNP. So all forms of recycling also usually grind plastic waste first, and this also creates MNP. So if plastic waste lies in landfill or in the environment, it continues to shed, and the MNP then act like a liquid moving through the soil. So if we incinerate plastics, we find MNP in the air, in the ash that is produced, and in the stack emissions. And all these emissions of MNP are not regulated or monitored across the life cycle because we don't fully recognize them as hazardous. So all these stages release MNP to their wastewater as well, and this ends up in sludge, which we then apply to our food crops. So we can see where the problem is going here. But I'll now hand over to my first co-author, Chidera, and Chidera will take us through some of the health impacts. Over to you, Chidera.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Hello, everyone. My name is Chidera Walton Dubisi. Yeah, I'm a medical doctor and also an environmental health researcher currently pursuing concurrent degrees at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, a PhD in infrastructure and environmental systems, and also a master's in public health with a concentration in epidemiology. Yeah, so my work bridges some critical intersections in public health and environmental science, and also my medical practice with a particular passion for infectious diseases. So my current research focuses on pressing global challenges, especially emerging wastewater contaminants like brominated flame retardants and microplastic pollution, and the emerging threat of multi-drug resistant organisms. Yeah, so this work aligns with my deep interest in infectious diseases, especially as microplastics can serve as vectors for pathogens, causing microorganisms and antibacterial resistant genes. So in essence, so as we've heard about what Karen has said, plastic production continues to increase dramatically. And these plastics inevitably break down into micro and nanoplastics. So I'll be discussing the health implications of MNPs exposure, which is particularly concerning given their ubiquitous presence in our environment. So the hazard potential of MNPs is complex and also multifaceted, depending on several key characteristics, ranging from the size of these particles, the shape, the polymer type, and also the chemical burden. So recent peer-reviewed publications have documented MNP accumulations in both human and animal tissues. And what's particularly alarming is that we are finding these particles in virtually every human tissue seen, ranging from the placenta to the brain. The evidence for health impacts is mounting rapidly. We now have strong evidence at the cellular level showing widespread inflammation and also significant oxidative stress responses. We're also seeing emerging evidence linking MNP exposures to cancer development, disruption of gut microbiome and intestinal health, endocrine system disruption, developmental impacts, particularly concerning for fetuses and children, respiratory health effects, cardiovascular complications, reproductive system damage, and neurotoxicity. So the challenge we face in risk assessment is quite significant. So traditional dose response methods are proving inadequate due to the extreme variability in MNP characteristics. So we are shifting towards studying associations between, first of all, documented exposure levels, human tissue accumulation patterns, and also the disease rate correlations. So this approach, while different from traditional toxicology, is providing crucial insights into the real-world impact of MNP exposures. Okay. So currently now we face several challenges in traditional epidemiological approaches. Firstly, the extreme variability in secondary MNP characteristics makes standardization quite difficult. Also, laboratory studies struggle to replicate realistic exposure scenarios, and we also have ethical constraints that limits direct human studies. However, we are developing new approaches to support policymaking, which are the regional and demographic studies correlating MNP presence with disease patterns, multiple lines of evidence combining both laboratory studies with real-world tissue sampling, and also the focus on vulnerable population and occupational exposure groups. So in essence, while more research is certainly needed, the evidence we have today is sufficient to warrant immediate action to address MNPs. So I will pass it on to Dr. Jeff to continue from where I stopped. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chidera. My name is Jeffrey C. I'm a professor of chemical engineering at the University of Kentucky in the United States, and I'll be attending as a delegate to the Inc. 5 negotiations in Busan. It's my distinct pleasure to discuss a new approach to the plastic circular economy, one focused on closed-loop capture to prevent the further introduction of micro and nanoplastic particles to the environment and ultimately our human bodies. As you've heard, we now understand that micro and nanoplastic particles, or MNPs, present a clear threat to human health and well-being. Unfortunately, our conventional ways of managing plastic waste, including landfilling, incineration, and recycling, are insufficient to deal with this growing challenge. As global manufacture and use of plastic continues to increase, even the traditional concept of the circular economy fails to effectively capture the shedding and release of particles as plastic pieces that break down through normal use as intended or degrade in the environment. As I will explain, our human relationship with plastic must be rethought and redesigned to tackle this newly realized risk. Our manufacture and use of plastic must be maintained in a closed-loop system to eliminate exposure and the public health risk it brings. Next slide, please. Previous thinking posited that plastic was permanent and inert, posing no hazard beyond the eyesore of trash on the ground. Plastic was thought to be safe for use in products, from microbeads and personal care items to toothbrushes to textiles to baby bottles. We now know that this isn't the case. What was thought to be a waste management problem has turned out to be an emergent public health crisis. Plastic is friable, meaning that it fractures into smaller and smaller particles over time and through everyday use, eventually reaching the micro and even nanoscale. Plastic abrasives, scrub pads release NMPs through use. Plastic equipment used in the manufacture of other products wears down in sheds. In our synthetic clothing, carpets, and furniture release plastic fibers. We now understand that even the goal of collecting and recycling 100% of post-consumer plastic can't stop the release of NMPs. The shedding of plastic for recycling, either mechanical or chemical, releases MMPs, exposing workers and leading to environmental release. We are exposed to MMPs not just through the environment, but in our homes via everyday items like paints, cookware, and food packaging. Even when captured and sequestered in a properly designed and managed landfill, plastics continue to break down into smaller and smaller pieces. These pieces eventually end up in the leachate and ultimately wastewater sludge, which is often land applied, exposing food crops to MNPs. Even incineration, as currently designed, doesn't effectively destroy NMPs, leaving it to be released as particulate through air emissions, wastewater discharges, fine baghouse dust, and in bottoms ash, which is often landfilled. Next slide, please. Plastic is persistent, but not permanent. We now understand that all plastic breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces over time and through use, eventually reaching the micro and nanoscale. This process occurs through weathering in the environment, such as by exposure to UV light, or just through normal use. The chemical additives that make up the polymer formulation are then able to more easily diffuse out of the matrix due to an increased surface area to mass ratio, as well as through newly exposed surfaces. This process is governed by the laws of molecular diffusion. Next slide, please. In addition to the chemicals intentionally added to the polymer formulation during manufacture, non-intentionally added substances such as contaminants from the raw materials, leftover catalysts, and reaction side products are also present and can leach out. If the MMPs have been exposed to environmental conditions, external persistent pollutant species from the environment, such as PCBs or PFAS, may adsorb onto the surface and be carried along with the particle. Finally, environmental microbes, including pathogens, may also adhere to the MNP surface and be carried along for the ride. Next slide, please. To address these concerns, we propose 6 strategies for consideration for inclusion in the global agreement to change this paradigm that we heard about at the introduction. Next slide, there you go. So the strategies we propose include overall reduction in production while eliminating production of plastic products known to commonly leak into the environment, effective recovery of post-use plastic in closed systems while preventing releases and emissions of plastic into the environment, including macro, micro, and nano, simplification of polymer formulations to eliminate plastic chemicals of concern, transparency along the supply chain to enable comprehensive risk assessment and tracking of additives, including migration and leaching profiles, development and adherence to design principles that reduce releases, emissions, and exposure to MNPs and risk of harm when exposure occurs. Finally, cleanup of legacy plastic in the environment, especially in low GDP countries where effective waste management infrastructure is limited. These strategies encompass the closed-loop design concept to eliminate exposure to MMPs both through environmental degradation and through normal use. Broadly speaking, these concepts address overall production, reduction, elimination, simplification, post-use recovery, transparency, redesign, and cleanup. Next slide, please. So as we have seen on this slide, this is the problem, but it doesn't have to be this way. Next slide, please. Traditional toxicology has historically focused on dose response to exposure, including the body's natural defense mechanisms. This focus has been on permissible exposure limits, threshold limit values, and lethal doses. This approach focuses on setting safe limits for exposure. However, exposure through MNPs embedded in tissue represents a potential hazard that has not been thoroughly evaluated. It is highly likely that there is no safe exposure threshold for MNPs. Although moving forward, certain essential uses for plastic will certainly remain, especially in the areas of healthcare, automotive, aerospace, moisture barriers, and home construction, among others, many categories of use must be eliminated. These include intentional release, such as time-release agrochemicals, degrading use, such as architectural paints and claddings, heated food containers and outdoor furniture, direct exposure use, such as textiles and food contact items, use constituting disposal, such as single-use items and packaging, and vulnerable population use, such as baby bottles and clothing, diapers, highly processed baby food, and items for critical care patients. Globally agreed upon essential use items must be captured and recycled where possible or destroyed completely, such as through thermal decomposition into liquid, followed by incineration with heat recovery. Since current incineration technology is insufficient to fully destroy MNPs, this process too must be reimagined and redesigned. In conclusion, to avert a global public health crisis, the plastic manufacture and use cycle must be redesigned, reprioritized, managed, and remediated to ensure that a closed-loop system is maintained throughout the life cycle. Thank you very much, and I will pass the floor to Mary Ellen Turnus.
Thank you, Jeff. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Very good. Thank you. I'm having tremendous difficulties here, though I'm on Ethernet. My name is Mary Ellen Turnus. I am an environmental lawyer and former chemical engineer, a colleague of Jeffrey C's, of Dr. C. We are senior fellows for the Global Council for Science and Environment. My background is different than most environmental attorneys. I've spent many years working for the United States Environmental Protection Agency, working in Superfund remediation and dealing with hazardous materials, including hazardous chemicals. We have been drawn into this discussion because we have, you can still hear me, correct?
Mhm.
Okay, good. Because we have noticed that the focus has been on hazardous chemicals and hazardous chemical exposure, as though the chemicals magically jumped out of the plastic and were not born on the particles that carried them. That was the issue that we first identified. Our image here, we have legal authorities and strategies. Our intent was to show you that it's not the particles we see, which are precursors of the small particles that you see in the insert. Those materials is recognized by the non-paper as hazardous substances. These are hazards. They're hazards in their own right. We have not recognized that hazard. Next slide, please. As you see here, all of what you see in red has been regulated differently. It's been regulated not as hazardous particles, but as, oh, I don't know, particulate, dust, carbonaceous soot. It's been regulated as turbidity in drinking water or total suspended solids in water, surface waters. It's been regulated as solid waste, but the actual nanoparticle, these small, tiny particles that we don't see, that don't go away because of the nature of plastic and how we made plastic to be permanent. These are hazardous in their own right, and we just don't see them. We think they're dust. We think they're pollen or dirt, or we think there are other materials that we have evolved to live with as a species, as the world has evolved to live with as a species. But these micro nanoparticles, the smaller they get, the more dangerous they are, because they do not go away. Where a net may capture a turtle or a whale, these tiny fibers can gum up the works of our cellular processes. This is what happens when you make something unnatural that does not go away and does not meaningfully biodegrade. Everything in green, we feel better. That's not the truth. Everything in red is what we are focusing on now. When we eliminate the bulk of plastic that does shed, we can protect ourselves from this material that we cannot see yet that is everywhere around us. Next slide, please. We have sufficient information to deal with this from a policy perspective. One of the struggles we've seen is that typically with conventional dose response, we are able to take a chemical and actually dose a mouse with it and then monitor its disease process. We can determine a specific dose for a specific, isolated, unique chemical and find the response. The problem with micro nanoplastic is, as you will hear later in the discussion, it's almost infinitely variable. It's not just the polystyrene beads that we have used in prior micro nanoplastic research that roll right out of biological organisms like tennis balls out of a cardboard box, because they don't hang up in a biological system. But these MNPs that we're talking about now, they are some of them are primary. They're designed to be micro or nanoparticles, but the bulk of what we're looking at are secondary micro nanoparticles that exist not just in the environment, but in our homes and in us because of the almost saturated nature of the planet with micro nanoparticles. And by that term, what I mean is specifically everywhere we look, we find them. We cannot find a place that does not have micro nanoparticles. Thus, the world, in my use of the term, is saturated. These micro nanoplastic particles are shards and filaments and curly little fibers. They are not these pristine little polystyrene balls. These other particles that we're dealing with have their own hazards. Now, we can't really see them. We're just now developing these methods to see them. What we need, and what I believe the precautionary principle allows us to deal with, is multiple lines of evidence that show, as we typically work with in the environmental context, we show that the potential for harm, the risk, and the hazard, not from something we may directly have to see, like through dose response, but through correlations where we understand what will happen. And this approach is necessary when you have an almost infinitely variable type of pollutant. So precautionary principle, I think the strong implementation precautionary principle, which is really quite diverse in reading our paper, you'll see how much flexibility we have in implementing the precautionary principle approach to getting a better policy to address the hazard from MNP. If we don't use it, if we're forced to have some sort of conventional dose response for this infinitely variable material that is not going to be represented in a lab, then we're going to be forced to go to litigation, which is costly, expensive, so inefficient. You're paying lawyers instead of actually trying to fund a transition away from the scenario that is causing such harm. Next slide, please. Lessons we have learned when we don't have precautionary principle here in the United States. We often, what happens is we have to see actual harm before we can adopt something, a regulation, a legislation. We're not good at adopting legislation proactively. In the United States, we don't have a lot. We have a Microbeads Act, we have a Save Our Seas Act, but we don't have specific plastic regulation right now. What happens is we have published research. Next slide, please. This published research tends to, and again, a lot of what we're seeing now is correlative research. It's not necessarily dose response. We have both tissue studies and we have dose response of animal studies and cellular studies. This is coming together now. You have seen the review papers that show the crescendo of reports on micro nanoplastics. So what we then move into this period of reaction, but it's not direct regulatory action. We have to go through this period of insurance companies developing exclusions. Liability becomes ripe for workers and consumers who are now pointing to the published researchers and saying, we're harmed. We have regulatory agencies thinking about making rulemaking. We have contract disputes now where entities that may be affected by this are saying, oh, it's not going to be my harm because I used this material that I bought from you. And then we have a chill in global business. Next slide, please. And then all of a sudden, litigation. This is what happens. We have litigation. And right now with plastic, we are having significant amounts of litigation. Lots of, if you look at plastic litigationtracker.org, you'll see summaries of the litigation matters that have been filed. And these are fast and furious now. Our paper covers 3 matters. The suits filed by New York, then Baltimore, then California. As this litigation develops, you see that businesses start to recognize that the litigation itself, whether or not they, the plaintiffs prevail against industry in these litigation matters, the fact that you could be pulled into this litigation starts to look a little bit like material risk. So businesses, once businesses is chilled, then you have adaptation of business, you have reform of business structure, you have liability sequestration, and then you start to see bankruptcies and displaced workers. We went through this in the United States with the adoption of the hazardous waste regulations when businesses that had not contemplated the cost of complying with the hazardous waste regulations went out of business because they were generating a lot of hazardous waste and hadn't contemplated in their business model the cost of properly disposing of this hazardous waste. Well, here we are. We're back in litigation mode again. Next slide, please. With the litigation, then you see action. In the United States, when we're not being proactive, we're being reactive. Litigation then will drive things like consumer and other product bans, worker protection standards, new environmental regulations, and all throughout you see bankruptcies and displaced workers. Next slide, please. And then what we find now and what we're seeing with PFAS, for example, is Superfund litigation. Now the Superfund lists, this is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation Liability Act, which is our Superfund law. We've now listed PFAS as hazardous substances. So we will soon see Superfund litigation, as well as common law litigation, trespass, nuisance, public nuisance. The cases that have been filed recently, the New York, Baltimore, and California, a lot of the elements of this case has involved public nuisance. Then, of course, all along the line, bankruptcies and displaced workers. It's ugly. Next slide, please. So what we know in the paper, as we discussed, is that we have existing industrial chemical product regulation. We have existing industrial regulation that could be used to regulate MNP. We could, through the precautionary principle, which not just, the shorthand is less compelling science, but I think it's compelling science. It's multiple lines of evidence. It's different ways of looking at things, but it's also a cost-benefit triage, if you will, that can allow shifting of the burden of proof, that can allow internalization of costs, that can involve industry to determine what might be the best approach. And industry is in the right position to ensure that their products pose no potential for release of MNP, no risk from MNP particle exposure if they are released, and no chemical risk from exposure to MNP. We have existing consumer product regulation, and that consumer product regulation should absolutely consider MNP testing and limits for MNP content and assurances that MNP would not be released. Remember the January paper in 2024 that was very concerning to us, given the 400,000 or so particles that they identified. 70% were nanoplastic in just a liter of water bought from, I think, Walmart. We have existing drinking water and food regulation, again, should include these testing and limits for MNP content, particularly containers, particularly those bags of vegetables you can heat in your microwave. Think about how much MNP is being released with that method, recommended method of food preparation. We also have existing environmental worker protection regulation that currently, again, does not consider MNP as a subset of particulate. It is a subset of hazardous substances within the particulate matrix that just doesn't recognize it. It's, again, as I've written about and as cited in our paper and other publications, micro nanoplastic masquerades as mere fine particulate PM2.5, which does not consider the source of plastic as part of the risk in setting our national ambient air quality standards here in the United States. We have total suspended solids under the Clean Water Act. We have turbidity in drinking water. But again, all of that is masquerading, is MNP masquerading as other pollutants and not considered for its own hazard. Next slide, please. So key points for our legal authority: we have sufficient information to adopt a policy towards a closed loop design pursuant to the precautionary principle. As Jeff discussed, chemical engineers made this material. Chemical engineers can design how to make sure that how we use plastic does not release MNP. It begins with reducing our overall planetary burden of plastic. We need to stop making so much plastic. If the planet is saturated in the sense that we can't go anywhere without finding it, we need to quit adding so much to this closed system that is our planet. We have to regulate design to reduce human exposure and harm from MNP by reducing the planetary burden, reducing the hazard from the plastic products, chemicals in use, protecting worker safety, ensuring product safety with the consumer protection, protecting the environment, and thus all human populations from MNP sources. The precautionary principle allows this tailored burden of proof. It allows the shifting burden of proof. And it can ensure that industry internalizes the cost of plastic, including the cost of plastic and MNP, to society, which will encourage them to want to shift to a closed loop design, just as it worked for the United States hazardous waste regulations, where industries were trying to shift away from generation of hazardous waste due to the continuing responsibility and hazards that arose from the generation that eventually would end up in a super sump fund site and tie them back to their generation of that waste. That's what we need to do with plastic and MNP. Next slide, please. So now we will shift to Nico. Thank you very much, Nico. Take it away.
So my name is Nico Orha. I will next highlight some important areas for addressing micro and nanoplastics in the Global Plastics Instrument, drawing from the findings of the technical foundation we heard from Chidera. Also, my presentation aligns with activities highlighted by Jeff and the findings from the country and regional reviews carried out by Mary. So next slide, please. So this is an overview of the measures. It includes incorporating the precautionary and polluter-based principles in the treaty, recognizing the hazard from MNPs, minimizing MNP emissions, releases, and exposure with strategic goals, reducing production and eliminating problematic plastic products, polymers, and chemicals of concern, enhancing plastic product and process design to minimize MNPs, minimizing MNP emissions and releases from industrial use and processes, ensuring transparency and traceability, also remediating legacy plastics to eliminate environmental sources of MNPs, and protecting human health from MNPs with specific measures, including MNP-specific risk assessment. So I'm next going through a handful of these proposed measures, also reflecting on the co-chairs non-paper that was published last week. And this paper might function as a basis for the negotiations in INC 5. So first, it's important to incorporate the precautionary and polluter-based principles in the treaty for controlling MNPs. And the rationale is that the potential health risks of MNPs is alarming, although strong evidence is still missing in many areas. And also the vast majority of health costs of MNPs are borne by society, while producers are typically responsible for only a small proportion of these costs. So it's proposed here to include the precautionary principle in the preamble or objective to lower the burden of proof to control MNPs. It's also proposed to include the polluter-based principle in the preamble to help internalize the cost of MNP pollution. The co-chairs paper in its preamble reaffirms the principles of the Rio Declaration from 1992, but it doesn't single out any of these principles at the moment. Next slide, please. It's important to define strategic goals in the plastics instrument to minimize emissions and releases from MNPs. And the rationale is that emissions and releases pose significant risks to occupational safety and consumer protection, as we've heard. And we've also heard that the planet is saturated with MNPs, and this is affecting ecosystem health and productivity. And it's proposed here to agree on a goal to minimize MNPs while endeavoring to achieve their elimination. And it will also be important to strive to agree on a cap on plastic production. The co-chairs non-paper refers to this in Article 7, that includes the goal to manage, reduce, and where possible, eliminate emissions and releases, and specifies several MNP activities. So it's important to retain and build on this provision. While not mentioned here, Article 6 addresses supply by referring to agreeing on a global objective of achieving sustainable levels of production. So this implies a certain cap, although it's not formulated as such in the co-chairs paper. Next slide, please. So coming to the next activity, it's important to reduce production and eliminate problematic plastic products and chemicals and polymers of concern. And the rationale here is that problematic plastic products contribute to human and planetary loading of MNPs, as mentioned already many times. And we also heard that chemicals of concern in plastics enter the body through MNPs. And it's proposed here to include in the treaty specific measures to eliminate products with intentionally added microplastics and other problematic plastic products to minimize the risk of MNP emissions and releases by listing them in an annex of the treaty. Also to eliminate chemicals of concern in plastics to minimize hazards of MNP exposure, again, by listing them in an annex. The co-chairs paper refers to this in Article 3, that includes a placeholder for developing measures and lists for banning and controlling plastic products and chemicals of concern used in plastic products. Next slide, please. And it's important for the treaty to enhance plastic product and process design to minimize MNPs. And the rationale is, as already mentioned, plastics are problematic as they break down to MNPs that enter the human body, releasing associated chemicals of concern. And it's proposed here to include measures in the treaty to redesign plastics and processes that utilize plastics by defining design criteria for minimizing MNPs. And also setting regulatory thresholds, as mentioned by Tuulia, for MNP releases, using best available technology design and mitigation measures for secondary MNP releases for problematic plastic products. The chair's non-paper provides an avenue to address this in Article 5 that encourages to promote enhanced design and performance of plastic products. So MNP releases and emissions should be included in the design aspect. Coming to the next slide, please. It's important that the treaty aims to minimize MNP emissions and releases from industrial use and processes specifically. So industrial processes from the production of plastics all the way to recycling contribute to MNPs, as we've heard, posing a significant health risk for workers. And it's proposed here to require adoption of best available technology design to eliminate MNP emissions and releases. Also specific provisions to ensure workers' safety from MNP exposure, and regulate MNP releases, both stack emissions and fugitive ground level emissions. The chair's non-paper provides an avenue to address this in Article 7 that requests taking measures to minimize emissions and releases of microplastics during production of plastics. And there's two more slides, so coming to the next slide, that talks to the need for the treaty to enhance transparency of MNPs and of course associated chemicals. And the rationale is that consumers are not informed of MNPs or the chemicals that are within them in the plastic products. And it's proposed here to include measures in the treaty to disclose the MNP shedding potential for products and the hazards through labeling. Also to develop emission and release profiles for products, and then develop MNP release and transfer registers for industrial and other processes to make the industry report on the microplastic emissions. The co-chair's non-paper provides an avenue to address this in Article 3 that provides a placeholder for transparency and traceability of products and chemicals, but does not specify any text to this end. Also, Article 5 encourages enhancing transparency of the chemical composition of products, but not referring to micro and nanoplastics. And coming to the last slide. Lastly, the treaty should protect human health from MNPs with specific and dedicated measures. And of course, the rationale again is an increasing body of evidence showing the potential human health effects of MNPs. And it's proposed here to include measures for the treaty to develop an inventory of those prioritized MNP high-risk sources for mitigation. Also to monitor the MNP levels in humans and environmental media and what are their impacts. Also, as mentioned, risk assessment will need to better accommodate risks from MNPs, moving from causality to correlation. And this is addressed in the co-chair's paper to some extent in Article 9 that gives specific recognition to impact of human exposure to microplastics, while Article 19 on health recognizes the need to protect all human health, with both articles supporting ongoing monitoring of health risks related to MNP exposure. And this was the final slide. So just to conclude, the co-chase non-paper provides many avenues to address MNPs, but there's a need to specify their specific role, which also could include a global cap as a very strong measure to address micro and nanoplastics, and then more specific measures from design all the way to waste management. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Nico, to Mary Ellen, to Jeff, and to Chidera for the introduction to the report. The link is there if you want to download the report. There's a lot more detail, obviously, in the report. But that concludes the introduction for the report. We will move into a panel discussion. We have three very excellent panelists with us today who've kindly volunteered to come and talk about their expertise in this field. We have firstly Bart Koolmans, who is a professor of aquatic ecology and water quality at the Wageningen University in Holland. I hope I produced that right. We'll then also invite Elena Butzi to discuss. Elena is an environmental policy analyst at the OECD. And we have Andres del Castillo, who's a senior attorney at the Center for International Environmental Law. So I might just ask Bart just to start with you, because we touched on risk assessment in our presentation, but you've been working in this area for a very long time, both for humans and the environment. So I was hoping maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about your work, specific more to the human health risk assessment side of things. Thanks.
I will do that. Thank you, Karen, for your kind introduction. My name is Bart Koolmans. I'm indeed a professor of water quality in the Netherlands, Wageningen. I'm not involved in the report, but working on risk assessment and exposure assessments for microplastic and nanoplastics for ecosystems, but also humans. And I'm an environmental chemist and toxicologist by training. Yeah, this is a metaphor. This pizza quattro stagioni would not have been a pizza like that without 4 elements being crucial in there. And the same applies to risk assessment. So it was mentioned several times that it would be very handy if there would be risk thresholds, that you know certain levels, regulatory thresholds. It has been mentioned that it would be good somehow to know there is no risk from this exposure, or there is risk of this exposure. Even though, of course, the precautionary principle, I think, is very important to consider. And in that sense, I can support the ideas in the report on that. But still, I think it's good that there is this parallel activity of trying to find out to what extent risk assessment, mechanistic assessments are possible. And that also different assessment frameworks can exist next to one another. And yeah, this is still the traditional approach of exposure and effects. And then at some point, you might be able to do a risk characterization. And the outcome of that, then, yeah, risk communication and management can build on that. And very important to communicate these risks very accurately. Now, how can this be done for a complex mixture as micro and nanoplastics? And this also has been mentioned already. So I would like to illustrate a possible approach with this graph. This is made in the context of the Bridget project. And in the left-hand side upper corner, you see something written like exposure modeling. This is about the emissions. So all kinds of activities and products that are made and used. And from those products in their daily use, particles are emitted. Abrasion, whatnot, all kinds of mechanisms are there. And this gives a very, very complex, diverse mixture. And that indeed is a challenge for defining exposure. What are we exposed to? It's not monodisperse, it's not one type of particle, it is very diverse. And if you look at this from a toxicological perspective, that means you would like to know how are the toxicologically relevant metrics distributed in this mixture. If it's one particle, 10 micrometer polystyrene, you might know, okay, that might cause a certain effect. But maybe for inflammation, you would like to know how are aspect ratios of particles distributed in a realistic microplastic, nanoplastic mixture that we are exposed to. If you know that, then you have a good starting point. So it would be about how are those hazardous characteristics distributed in the mixtures that humans are exposed to. And that is illustrated in this big middle box over here. And if you look a bit at the left-hand side, you see those distributions. So there is an approach being followed now in various research projects to measure those distributions in, well, the food we eat, the air we breathe, and the water we drink, so that we know what we are exposed to. And then you can start looking into the human body, how particles are being distributed. So there is a whole discipline of science focusing on PBK modeling. This has been done earlier for chemicals and also for engineered nanomaterials. And indeed, both of these pollutant categories or substance categories are more defined in a single way. It's always this chemical, it's always this particle, monodisperse or fairly monodisperse. But once again, here we would have to do this biodistribution, considering the distribution for polydispersed particles, and then all based on these different characteristics. So the human body would be some sort of a filter where certain particles penetrate far deeper in the body and other particles might not penetrate at all. And if you know something about the particles and about the human body, and you bring those two together, then you can make predictions. And these can be validated with the concentrations that we find in human tissues, organs, and bodily fluids. At the right-hand side, and I think that is still a fairly open area of research, a lot is done in this area. That's the effect assessment. A whole array of tools is being used internationally in many major projects, doing in vitro tests, in vivo tests, models being used for certain tissues that mimic certain translocation or transfer processes in the human body to put numbers on where effects start to occur, if there are thresholds. And otherwise we would not find a threshold, and there would be an effect right away, or an effect threshold would be very high. The chance that for some particles in this complex mixture, there is something going on in a certain organ or tissue, of course, is real and plausible. It's just a matter of finding out. And yeah, I think that this is going on at present in various research activities. And then the bottom box is where these two things would come together, essentially not giving one risk characterization ratio, like 10 divided by 2 makes 5, but because the particles are diverse and their properties are distributions, and also the conditions in the human body and also among individuals are so very variable, typically the outcomes would be a distribution. And still, these distributions could be very valuable to have for policymakers, regulators, and risk assessors to bring this field further. Now, this is a bit about the traditional approach, however, adapted to the complexities of micro nanoplastics. But it doesn't mean that other endpoints, like what has been mentioned earlier, like looking at diseases, can also fit in a framework like this, or can be merged or integrated with this framework. It's also very, very crucial to look at correlations between exposures and longer-term developments in populations on diseases that you see. Of course, the challenge then is that there are also so many other factors that affect our health. But okay, that's a discipline in its own. This was my most important slide, actually. I have two more to just illustrate some Some other important things. This is from a recent paper where we review 20 years of research developments in the micro and nanoplastic research arena. So again, illustrating the complexity of the material, which implies that bioavailability and bioaccessibility for different organisms, including humans, of course, and also organs and tissues, differs so enormously, which again illustrates that we need to think of the material as a continuum of characteristics, also in a toxicological sense. Another challenge, however, where we are making important progress in, I think, is illustrated here. Yes, indeed, there is this growing body of evidence that particles are present in the human body. That's clear. However, it's still uncertain, different measurement methods used. There's only a handful of studies. The data are not aligned. Different methods have different particle size detection limits and so on. And the same applies for effects data. Now, the good news is that there are increasingly alignment methods available to translate all the different types of measurements into a common currency so that we can use them in exposure and biodistribution models and link them to toxicological effects. So this is a brief reflection from my side on where we are with microplastic, nanoplastic exposure and risk assessment science. And this is my final slide. So the framework is available. Frameworks are available. That's the good news. However, populating them with high quality data takes time, and that probably will take several years. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Bart. So we'll move on to Elena. Elena is the environmental policy analyst from the OECD. Now, the OECD recently published a report with policy scenarios to 2040 for the elimination of plastic pollution. So, Elena, I was hoping you could just share some insights on where you think the current direction of travel is going and the implications for plastic pollution. But particularly maybe how the problem of microplastic emissions differs from that of plastic waste leakage and what the policymakers can do to hopefully comprehensively end plastic pollution. So, Elena, thank you. Over to you.
Yes, good day to everyone, and thank you very much, Karen, for the introduction, as well as for the opportunity to join this discussion. And thanks also to all of the speakers who spoke before me for the very insightful presentations, including the launch of the report. So I'm Elena Buzzi. I'm from the OECD Environment Directorate, where, as Karen mentioned, we have been working for the past 5 to 7 years on the topic of policies to eliminate plastics pollution. And to answer your multiple questions, I'll draw from insights from some of our recent work in this area. Yes, so I'd like to start my intervention by providing an overview of the current direction of travel, or in other words, the implications of business as usual. So UNEA Resolution 514 calls for the end of plastics pollution. Under current policies, by 2040, so in just 15 years, we'd be still very far from reaching this goal unless there is a very ambitious change in policy action. First, under business as usual, as plastics use and waste generation continue to grow, we would see continued increases in the releases of plastics to the environment, which will reach about 30 million tons of plastics waste entering nature by 2040, up from about 20 million tons in 2020. In addition, microplastics emissions will also increase, nearly doubling from 2020 levels by 2040. Secondly, waste that is informally burned or dumped in the open would also increase to 119 million tons per year, amplifying risks such as air pollution and impacts on human health. Thirdly, greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with the life cycle of plastics would also nearly double, reaching about 2.8 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, so about 5% of total greenhouse gas emissions estimated in 2040. And in addition to that, other life cycle impacts, including toxicity, human toxicity, will also continue to amplify. So the future ahead under a business as usual scenario is quite sad and gloomy, and urgent action is needed to mitigate this environmental and human health problem comprehensively. Recent work that we have done in this area shows that there is a viable path to eliminating plastics pollution, and that is the implementation of global stringent policies all along the life cycle of plastics. This can get us very close to ending the leakage of plastic waste to the environment by 2040. And just to give you a rundown of what would be the components of an effective policy mix, well, interventions upstream and midstream to curb production and demand for plastics, as well as to improve the eco-design of plastics products, would account for about 25% of overall reductions in the releases of plastics to the environment, mainly because they help to keep products in use for longer and they reduce waste streams. And secondly, policies to improve the collection, recycling, sorting, and treatment of waste would contribute for another 70% of reductions in plastics leakage by 2040. So overall, a whole of life cycle approach, if implemented globally and with stringent policies, could come very close to ending the leakage of plastics waste to the environment by 2040. Now, this is about plastic waste or macroplastics leakage. But of course, as we just heard, microplastics pollution is also a very important component of plastics pollution, and a very complex and diverse one. Many microplastics can come from the degradation of plastic waste that is mismanaged, but we also need to look at emissions of microplastics that come during the production and use phase of plastics products. And from a policy perspective, it's very important to recognize that microplastics pollution requires a very different set of interventions that what macroplastics or plastics waste does. Usually, macroplastics leakage is highly associated with the lack of effective waste collection systems. And as you can see there on the chart on the screen, it generally tends to go down or decrease in the size of the problem as countries develop and improve their waste management systems. So in general, it's a problem that decreases in size as countries develop. While microplastics are a different animal, microplastics emissions. It's an issue that all countries face. And generally, the trajectory is that emissions increase as countries develop and increase their use of plastics, because microplastics emissions from production and use are highly correlated with plastics use in the economy. So additional interventions that are targeted to emission sources will be required to mitigate this source of pollution. So concretely, what can policymakers do to mitigate plastics pollution? Here, I will present just a few insights, and I think many of these align and repeat some of the points that have been already said by other speakers. But first, we need policymakers to continue to promote research to strengthen the knowledge base to inform intervention. In particular, to continue to improve our understanding of the risks, and also to understand a bit better what is the cost effectiveness of the different options for mitigation measures that we have available currently. in particular where there may be trade-offs in intervening with other environmental concerns. We need to advance research, but at the same time, we know very well that the need for further research is not should not justify delaying intervention. There is already sufficient evidence, as we have heard, to call for mitigation action to reduce exposure levels and risks. And in taking policy action, a life cycle approach is recommended, in particular focusing on reducing the emissions of microplastics and plastic waste leakage at source is likely to be most cost effective, especially considering that many microplastics become diffuse pollutants, so they would be very difficult to capture via end-of-pipe solutions once they are released to the environment. At the same time, given the nature of the problem and the many unknowns that still persist, it's important to remind policymakers that there are many opportunities to make gains in microplastics mitigation, microplastics pollution mitigation, by acting on co-benefits with other environmental policy objectives. In other words, there are many interventions that might be driven by other environmental policy concerns that also deliver benefits in terms of reducing microplastics releases to the environment. And I'll give you a few examples of those. First, eco-design of plastics products. We know very well that if we take out, gradually phase out potentially hazardous chemicals from plastic products, not only we reduce the inherent risk associated with microplastics once they enter the environment, but we can also reduce human health risks all along the life cycle of plastics products. Gradually phasing out intentionally added microplastics in products is also a no regrets measure that can be introduced in most countries. Our solutions are developed. Another interesting example is the one of transport, where many interventions that are intended generally to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution can also lower the wear of tires and road surfaces, and as such also reduce microplastics emissions. So for instance, this can include reducing overall passenger vehicle use and lightweighting vehicles that are manufactured. Or thirdly, another example is acting at the level of consumers to promote best use practices, for instance, eco-driving with vehicles, or best washing practices for synthetic textiles, which are practices that can deliver benefits in terms of reducing microplastics emissions, but can also, for instance, improve the durability of products and reduce needs for additional raw materials. Ultimately, we really need to act all along the life cycle of products to reduce microplastics pollution. So product eco-design and material innovation is really critical to reduce the inherent harmfulness and shedding propensity of products during use. And secondly, we also need to consider the relevance of end-of-pipe solutions to capture microplastics once they are released, in particular, potentially at pollution hotspots. So overall, I think findings from our recent work are quite aligned with the report that's being launched today, in particular on the need for a whole of life cycle approach to the problem of plastics pollution, on the need to slow down production and demand for plastics, and on the need to look at really how plastics materials and products are designed to reduce environmental and human health risks. With that, I conclude, and I hand over to you, Karen.
Thank you, Elena. And I also liked your idea of the no regrets policies there. We'll move now quickly to Andres. Andres is the last of our panelists, but certainly not the least, because he works at the Center for International Environmental Law, where they've published a number of very impressive reports related to plastics governance. So I'm not going to try and list them all, but I was hoping, Andres, that you could tell us a bit more about some of your findings in your reports in the context of our discussions here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank to all the panelists, because you are making my task more easy. Many of the things that I was planning to say was already said by many of you, but I want to start with this image of the Trojan horse, thinking that microplastics are pollutants and treating them as pollutants, and that they are the carriers, and they contain plasticides, flame retardants, POPs, unreacted monomers, and PHH. Next slide, please. Wanted just to give to highlight one of the findings of the GSAM of one of the reports on sea-based source of marine litter from 2021, where they say that some evidence suggests that the use of microplastic in offshore oil and gas activities could be substantial, and microplastics are used in the production and drilling processes in oil and gas activities. And this is paradoxical. Is the idea that we are using, or industry is using, microplastic to pump oil and gas from the ocean, and that the releases from those microplastics into the ocean are substantial. And this is paradoxical because you use that same oil and gas to produce plastics, as 99% of the plastic comes from hydrocarbons. And I want also to mention that to highlight one of the tweets of the first reaction on the US elections result that we all are aware of, and how we think that this can be a major blow to the global climate action. But then Christina Figueres is saying that also there is a weakest fossil fuel industry because it's the unsolvable volatility and the inefficiency. And I guess the plastics treaty is an opportunity to spread ahead and to accelerate climate action, because plastic pollution is a climate problem too. We know from some studies that plastic production will consume up to 31% of the remaining carbon budget by 2050. So this is the opportunity to act and to accelerate the climate action to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. And I just want to reinforce what OECD defined as plastic pollution, and looked at as more broadly as all emissions and risks resulting from the plastic production, use, waste management, and leakage. Next slide, please. And as you were saying at the beginning of the presentation, at CL we were developing some reports, not only on governance on plastic, but on microplastics too, using a sectorial approach, or seeing how science is developing and showing us the different hazards and exposure of microplastics on for instance, the agricultural sector, where microplastic is used as the carrier of pesticides and fertilizers that enter into the soils and is threatening actually the soils themselves. Then also microplastic in the atmosphere, because we are breathing plastics, and there is more and more evidence on that, and how the EU is tackling this. So those are some of the reports that we produced recently. Next slide, please. Here, basically, one of the main conclusions is that more production of plastics means more pollution. We have a study from April this year that is showing us a methodology to demonstrate how the increase on production of plastic is linked to the pollution, and the pollution includes microplastics too. And we know that if we don't take action, for instance, the volume of airborne microplastic and toxic emission will follow the expected rise of plastic production too. Next slide, please. Then something very interesting, and I saw one of the questions of the in the chat, that is, what is the definition? How can we define microplastics? But also there is some clarity that will be necessary, and is when we talk about permeoplastic polymers, for instance, and when we talk about plastic polymers, and when we talk about pellets, what are we referring to? Are we referring to microplastics or not? Because that will help us to also define what kind of policy we need. We have a compilation of key terms using the different multilateral environmental agreements, but also by the EU different legislation on what are the definitions of microplastic that has been used from a legal perspective. And I invite all of you to look at this compilation. Next slide, please. Then, as I won't repeat what Nico was presenting about how the idea of microplastic repeats or is reflected in the third version of the non-paper, but I will show you kind of the historical evolution or not of how governments are looking at that within the negotiation of the plastics treaty. And we know that there are already 3 versions of a draft, and also 3 versions of the chair views on how the potential structure of the treaty need to be. And we know that in Nairobi and then in the compilation text, we will find kind of a standalone provision on microplastics and micro nanoplastics, but that is not the case for the versions that the chair presented as non-paper. But that doesn't mean, next slide please, that is not included. But we see already that in the compilation text that is so far the starting point for the negotiation, we will see if countries will accept the non-paper of the chair as the basis for negotiation of, and how complementary will be the compilation draft with the non-paper. But already we see that in the compilation text, we have seen many mentions and reference to microplastics. Sometimes those references are contradictory, but sometimes are complementary to say, like, first is like the recognition that microplastics also are linked to plastic pollution. What is something that comes from the text of the UNEA resolution 5.14 and is absent in the current non-paper, but is within the compilation text. And then the scope, in the scope we see a contradiction where sometimes include within the scope the microplastic, but also in bracket you will have what could be the areas that can be excluded from the scope of the treaty, and a microplastic is also listed there, just to show how there's a wide range of policies on how countries are seeing that, but also there is the standalone provision on microplastic, and on the exceptions we see mentions and reference to microplastics, and including also inclusions on the financial part and the trade measures. Next slide, please. Then on the chair's paper, we see in 3 parts the inclusion of microplastics. We see that in the definition there is this kind of idea to or intention to how we will define microplastic. Also in the article related to emissions and releases is included the microplastic. We know that when you see the list of microplastic and nanoplastic during the use and products, I think that microplastics is a cross-cutting issue and needs to be seen as something that we need to tackle all across the life cycle of plastics, and need to be included and referenced in different articles of the Plastics Treaty. And we see that also in the article on health. That is an article that, when you look at the action, that are really is weak, because it's an article that kind of give you non-binding measures, right? And here I want to highlight that already countries under the UNCLOS Convention, they have specific obligations related to the need to measures to prevent, reduce, and control pollution of the marine environment. And here, from the legal perspective, it's important to mention that there is a differentiation between the need to reduce And when it comes to toxins and harmful of noxious substances, especially those which are persistent, the obligation is not an obligation of reduction, but it's an obligation of minimization to the fullest possible extent. And this is very important to highlight because we already have an obligation that is asking countries to do more than just reduce, to minimize. And we need now to make sure that the treaty has the specific tools for tackling the issue of microplastic, primary and secondary. Next slide, please. And our recommendations, just to finish, are also coincide with with the findings of the report, but also with what the previous panelists were saying. That is, first we need to consider a combined cocktail effect on the precautionary principle first, then the need to access to information, then adopt legally binding measures to ban and reduce the production and release of microplastics and plastics, associated chemicals, then banning intentional microplastics, and also include, for instance, in the sectorial approach, include a target for a global phase out of microplastic use in agriculture, something that is feasible. And then look at the full life cycle of plastics and regulate the upstream part from fossil fuel extraction to material production. And monitoring and reporting provisions will be very important, and the need to include indicators on human health protections, such as biomonitoring of plastic chemicals, microplastics, and nanoplastics. And with this, I end my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andres. Great to bring in some of the UNCLOS and the other instruments as well. So that brings us to the end of the panel discussion. We've also run out of time. Actually, we've gone over time, but I think most of our questions in the Q&A have been answered. So thank you to everyone who's answered those questions. I just wanted to check if Tulia from Finland was still on the line. If Tulia just wanted to say some closing remarks from your perspective.
Yes, thanks. I'm still here. It's getting dark here, though.
Right.
But I won't take much of your time. I just wanted to wish a warm thank you for the presenters and the panelists. We indeed got a lot of information today, and it is good to take them with us to Busan. And also, I like to thank all the participants for their interest and the Geneva Environment Network and other organizing entities. Thank you all for a good and informative event. And I wish us all good luck in the INC negotiations, and let's hope for a successful outcome, including the microplastics, which should be solidly in the provisions of the plastic treaty. So see you in Busan, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. Just over to Diana. Is there any closing statements from?
Indeed, I would like to thank you all, particularly the authors of this report, the other panelists. It was a very interesting discussion, and so we encourage you to share the link of the recording of this event and of the page where you can find all the resources that were mentioned throughout the event. So congratulations to all. Thank you also for all the attendees who are still with us and those who will be later watching the video of this event. I would like to bring to your attention 3 more events that we are hosting in the run-up to Busan. One is taking place tomorrow. It's about the designing on an effective future plastics treaty, how we can get it effective. It's happening tomorrow at 4 p.m. Geneva time, so we look forward to see you online. But we have 2 more coming up next week, one looking at recycling issues and the other one looking indeed at the health aspects. So a lot of the elements that were brought into the discussion today are also going to be very relevant for the discussion we will have at 2 p.m. on the 14th of November, where we are looking at strengthening the health aspects of the future plastics treaty. So with that, we thank you all. And we look forward to see you online at upcoming events.
Thank you.